What is up, gunfighters? Saddle up for another episode of Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about gunfighting with God at the center. God is number one, period. I hope to keep him number one in my life and everything that I do, and this podcast is no different. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about surplus. Now, firearm surplus is nothing new, nothing different, but maybe today we're going to look at it in a different way. Instead of military surplus, law enforcement surplus. That's what today's episode is going to be about. Before we get into the bio, I want to say if you like this content, make sure you're subscribed so you get new episodes when they come out. Also, if you like this, scroll down, there's a little box with an arrow. If you don't know how to share stuff, scroll down, there's a box with an arrow. Feel free to share this episode or any of the other episodes you think people might like. Feel free to share those with people that you think will enjoy them. I hope you'll want to become an active part of this podcast, and you can do that, without any monetary cost to you by just scrolling down, subscribing, hitting some stars, and sharing it with somebody you think might enjoy it. With that, the bio. Who am I? A question we should all ask ourselves. I am, first and foremost, a servant of God, made in his very own image, a follower of Jesus Christ, a simple man called by God to the Great Commission to share the good news of Jesus Christ. Next, a little bit about my background and what God has allowed me to do and blessed me to do in life. Grew up what most would consider very poor in the backwoods of the southeastern and mid-Atlantic United States, hunting and fishing. Joined the Marine Corps at 17. Did a couple of combat tours in Iraq. So a decorated Marine Corps combat veteran. Infantry assaultman. After the combat tours, I was an urban warfare instructor for the United States Marine Corps under Mojave Viper. I also served in the U.S. Army, both full-time and part-time National Guard. Also a veteran of law enforcement. I served with LAPD. I was a sworn peace officer, a cop for LAPD. I worked regular patrol assignments and more specialized assignments. One of those more specialized assignments was warrant service, fugitive recovery. Also had some other law enforcement roles. I am an FBI certified firearms instructor and been certified by another 3-letter government agency in a lot of firearms and training things. I've also been a private contractor, worked in the private sector pertaining to tactics and gunfighting and protecting America from enemies foreign and domestic. I served as the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters in a large metropolitan area. That was our primary mission, to stop active shooters, which sadly are a thing in America today. I've also been blessed to do quite a bit of competition shooting. Started my first formal competitions even before joining the Marine Corps at 17. I had won more shooting competitions than I can remember. I have competed in all manner of disciplines in shooting. I've been blessed to be a state rifle and pistol champion, West Coast regional champion. Like I said, been blessed to win more shooting competitions than I can remember. Mentioned hunting. I've hunted to put meat on the table starting when I was a child. I've also been a professional big game hunter and guide, hunting and slaying all manner of beast. And I don't apologize for that. Humbled to be the host of 3 podcasts. Simple Man Sermons, Alpha Male Podcast, and Gunfighter Life. Obviously, as things not mentioned, I've been blessed to do many other things. But, again, first and foremost, I'm a servant of God, a believer and follower of the Bible, the Word, Jesus Christ. And I don't apologize for that. With that, let's transition into today's topic. If you want to thank me for any of that service and you like the podcast, scroll down if you're listening on Spotify or iTunes or perhaps other platforms and hit some stars, a quick, easy rating. Help other people find the podcast. With that, let's get into the day's topic. Let's talk about surplus. Surplus firearms. If you grew up in guns and you've been in guns for a while, you're probably no stranger to surplus. But usually, when you say surplus, most people conjure up images of like World War II, Vietnam, Cold War era surplus. Military surplus, commonly referred to as lesurp. Well, there's a whole different category of surplus guns and gear. Law enforcement surplus. I guess lesurp certainly doesn't sound very good. Kind of sounds like a sloppy way of eating or something. But law enforcement surplus as opposed to military surplus. There was kind of a really good age after World War II. I'd say probably from World War I to the end of the Cold War, where surplus stuff, even up into the 80s, 90s, military surplus stuff was often a great buy. You know, when you could get an SKS for $129. When you could get a Mosin a Gant for $79. I saw an ad the other day. If it was real, it was pretty awesome. It was a World War II Willys Jeep in a crate for $50, like an old magazine ad. But we don't live in those times now. And a lot of that military surplus has dried up. And a lot of the guns, after the SKS for most nations, had fully automatic capabilities, which means they're not really eligible or able to be imported into the U.S. I won't say all, but a lot of that really good military surplus has kind of dried up where it was a great value when you could get Lee Enfields for dirt cheap or so many other military surplus stuff. And a lot of that stuff has dried up. So where else can one turn for a good value and good quality made firearms? Well, I'd submit to you, there's a whole other category that people don't often think about with surplus, and that is law enforcement surplus. Now, as you heard in the bio, I was a law enforcement officer for quite a large chunk of my adult life. So I know a little bit about that world, and I know there are some real hidden gems in that law enforcement surplus world. So many different agencies and so many different guns. Far more variety than most militaries because they're all unique and a lot of them have their own purchasing power and agreements and different guns. Just an example, I was LAPD. I worked more specialized assignments. I worked all over in the nastiest parts of the city, but my main beat was Venice Beach. That's one division of LAPD, and I believe it had 19 divisions at the time, and I think it may have 21 now. Different divisions. On the East Coast, they call it a precinct. But just Venice Beach Pacific Division was surrounded by a bunch of independent municipalities. Think of it kind of like law enforcement Swiss cheese. So you had Culver City just to the east. It was its own city, had its own police department. You had Santa Monica, which was its own PD, its own police department. You had El Segundo, again, Borders Pacific Division, own police department, own PD, own budget, own guns. And that's just that one division. And again, there's 19 divisions. And that's just what I can think of at the top of my head. And that's just one little spot. Think about just all of Southern California and how many different police departments there are and how many different guns. Really cool guns. So perhaps we're missing kind of hidden gems here by only thinking about surplus as military surplus. And not just the guns that they use. What about the guns that they confiscate? Crates and crates of just really cool, really odd guns. Some really good guns, some really collectible guns. Now, sadly, I know firsthand that some police departments destroy guns rather than sell them again, rather than resell them. And that is sad. But many don't. Many will sell them again. And many will sell them back to the manufacturer, let's say, in order to shuck responsibility or get rid of some of that liability. They'll sell it back to, say, FN or some big manufacturer, and that manufacturer will resell them as refurbished guns. So Sig Sauer may have, let's say, a run of law enforcement guns that got traded in for something else, a newer model, a different caliber, and they're going to resell all those guns. They're going to inspect them so they don't have any liability if something's dangerous. They're going to inspect them and then resell them. One quick example, at my last job, we had an opportunity to purchase something. We only bought one and we should have bought more. LE trade-in, 320s and 45 ACP. Full gun, magazine, everything for $300 and something. Bought one and it sold right away. We probably should have bought more. But that's just one example, because the 320 did come out in 45 ACP, but it never really caught on. So it was one of those things, the cops were probably going to 9mm or who knows what happened, but they had a big deal on a bunch of those 45 ACP 320s, and that's just one example. There are so many examples. How about the last generation of law enforcement handguns? I would consider it like a generation before. The Smith & Wesson 59s and 5906s, I talked about those before on another episode, but they're great, fantastic guns, and those are just the most prevalent. They made a ton of what I would call like the 2-digit and 3-digit and 4-digit Smith & Wessons. And they made everything from, I believe, some subcompact, like ultra-concealed carry lightweight 45 ACPs, to full-size double-stack 9mm, even 10mm. They made all kinds of cool stuff. And there were agencies that adopted all number of those. I want to say CHP, even until fairly recently, still use those old Smith & Wesson. I forget if they were 59, 5906, one of those derivatives. CHP used those. CHP is a big department. That is, the highway patrol for one of the largest states in the nation and the most populous state in the nation. I can only imagine how many guns CHP had. And again, they're good guns. And before I dive into a bunch of other specific models, I should say something that might get me some flack, but it's true, so I'm going to say it. The vast, vast majority of cops are not gunfighters. I know, because I've been a professional gunfighter most of my adult life, and I was a cop for a big chunk of it. And I know that the Venn diagram overlap there between actual gunfighters and cops is very small. A lot of cops will shoot only when it's qual time. It's not enough training. That'd be like if I only worked out once a month or once every other month. That doesn't make a gunfighter. Sorry, it doesn't. Cops are employed as administrators, and they carry a gun in case someday they may have to use it. Most cops are not gunfighters. Some are. Some take it very seriously and take it upon themselves to be good shots. But sadly, that is a tiny, tiny minority. What does that mean for this episode for surplus? That means that most law enforcement trading guns don't get shot very much. They get shot, 50 rounds every month or every 2 months? Some departments only qual twice a year. The likelihood of a gun getting shot out, which people worry about, I've worked in the gun industry long enough to know that people worry about that, even though it's almost never a thing. Way more guns are destroyed due to poor cleaning than they are from getting shot out, quote unquote, shot out, especially handguns. They're fairly low pressure. Shooting out a 9mm barrel or a 45 ACP barrel, that takes some doing. And the springs, like the mainspring, if those are worn out, you're talking usually a $10 part. So worrying about them getting shot out for the purposes of this episode for law enforcement surplus, it's so insignificant a thing as to not even really be a concern. A lot of them get carried a lot, obviously. So holster wear, like the bluing worn off, that's probably a thing on a law enforcement trade-in. But this is gunfighter life, so who cares about that? You're probably going to beat it up and drop it and do things like that to it anyway. So you just get some bonus character. I wouldn't worry about them not being functional, not being good fighting handguns. We're doing this for collector. We just recently did an episode on collectible guns that are still good for gunfighting. If you want to collect it, then maybe get one in pristine condition. Or if they're dirt cheap, buy two. Use the one in better condition to save it for maybe it's something special, and then use the other one to beat the crap out of and train with. And if you break it, carry the other one. That's a real common thing I do as a gunfighter. I'll have two very similar, if not identical, guns that are set up and shoot and point in the same way. And one's my go-to and one's my backup. Because I break guns all the time. I'm sitting here carrying a SIG 226 Legion, which is a decent gun known for being robust. And I've broken it several times just this year. It's been dropped on rocks, went skidding, all kinds of stuff. It happens. So, again, if you're doing this for law enforcement surplus trade-in, if they're cheap enough, maybe buy two and run the crap out of one, train with it, and have the other one for a backup, or have the other one for whatever, for collecting. And then if something happens to your main one, you pull the other one out. Because your life and things like that and being able to protect yourself and loved ones is more important than collectible value. At least it should be if your priorities are right. But I wouldn't worry about them being shot out. I wouldn't worry about anything like that. Getting back to what we're talking about, the last generation of handguns, the Smith & Wesson 59s, what about a little bit before that? Even when I was LAPD in the early aughts, there were still cops that carried revolvers. There were still LAPD that carried revolvers. You still likely can find some good revolvers that are law enforcement trade-in. Maybe a U.S. Marshal, Smith & Wesson 357 Magnum or something like that. What an awesome gun. What a great surplus gun to have. And there are so many different models. Chief Specials, Detective Specials. For the vast majority of the 20th century, most police departments, most police agencies, most law enforcement in the U.S. carried revolvers, either in 38 Special or 38 Special 357 Magnum. And you know what? They worked good, and they're still good guns. And a lot of them still probably have a lot of life left in them. So if you can find one with a little bit of bluing worn off the muzzle, and it's a good deal because it's a law enforcement trade-in, if the timing is still good and still got a good lockup and everything like that, then don't look a gift horse in the mouth, as the saying goes. Especially if you're going to carry it in the backcountry, carry it in the woods, put it in your glove box for, a backup car gun to hand to somebody if you've got a passenger that's not armed and you want to arm them for whatever scenario. They're great for that. And again, they have a big history and a big character. It's a really cool thing. So the revolvers, I guess you would be going back 2 generations, and then your early generation semi-autos. If you could find, I think they're ugly. But I'm not a Glock guy. A lot of people really love Glocks, and I think that the Gen 1 and Gen 2 Glocks one day are going to bring in a premium. So if you can find some of those law enforcement trade-ins, that'd be a great gun to have and run. And there's all the other generations too. I've even seen Gen 5s, which I think of as a very new gun, but I guess they've been out a few years. Quite a few of Gen 5 Glock police trade-ins, which I'll be honest, for a functionality, I think the Gen 5s are the best gen that have ever been out. And again, I'm not a Glock fan, but I do think the Gen 5s are better than the previous generations. But if you're going to shoot and train and run a gun hard, one of those Gen 5 Glock police trade-ins, you can get it for a couple $100 cheaper and spend that money on a training class or on ammo. Why wouldn't you do that? Who cares if it's used the first day you take it out and train with it? It's going to be used anyway. Also, the hkusp was a big gun for a long time, and they are freaking fantastic. They are very, very underrated. I would take one of those if you put it on the table over a Glock any day, the hkusps, over any gen. The hkusps are a fine gun. They're about as finely made and as robust and beautiful a handgun as a plastic framed polymer handgun can be. They're just magnificent. They are reliable. They are robust. And again, I think one of the most underrated fighting handguns, which I've mentioned in other podcasts. People probably get sick of me saying it, but I think the best combat handgun ever made is the Beretta 92s and all of their iterations. You can likely find those as law enforcement trade-ins. Both the 92 and the 96, which is the 40 cal version of the 92. But they were used by a lot of departments. They were big back in the 80s. Think about Lethal Weapon, Die Hard. The 80s, early 90s. That was like the cool gun to have. And it's a great gun. If you find one that's got a little bit of the, however they pronounce it, Brunton finish or something worn off on the slide, or got a few nicks and dents in the slide or the frame, the aluminum is worn off and it's got kind of a silvery finish, buy it. What works really well and stuff like that? Spray paint. Especially if you're going to run it and run it hard. We talked about, laptop bag guns or some other kind of gun. Maybe you want a little bit bigger gun than your EDC gun, ready to go if something happens. You want a little bit more firepower than that J-frame. You want something a lot more shootable. Handles, because it is a full-size fighting handgun that handles faster and more accurately than, a Ruger LCP. Having one of those in a bag ready to go, it's a great option. What about the big rival to the Beretta 92s, the SIGs, the SIG 229s? I carried one of those as a police officer for quite a while. And the 226s, if you don't know, the 229 is kind of like the Glock 19 version of the 226. Would be more like the Glock 17 version of full size and what they call a compact, although they're still pretty big guns. But sorry, I almost said Smith & Wesson. The SIG 229s, 226s, and 9mm and 40. You're going to find a lot of police trade-in stuff in 40 caliber. But a lot of that stuff is backwards compatible. A lot of that stuff in 40, you can just get a conversion barrel for 9mm. In fact, the gun, my go-to carry gun, is a Sig Sauer Legion 226. It came in 357 SIG. I got a screaming deal on it. It wasn't a law enforcement trade-in, but it was a trade-in. And I got it knowing that it was a good deal, even if I budgeted in a 40 to 9mm conversion drop-in barrel. And then me as a survivalist, as a prepper, it also came with a 40 cal barrel. So now I have one gun, my go-to handgun on my side, that has the ability to shoot 9mm, 40, and 357 SIG. That's a lot of flexibility, especially in a situation where ammo shortages are a thing. In general, I will say 9mm is by far the best caliber to have in stock and shoot and practice with. But in times when ammo gets really crazy, I might stumble across a great deal on 357 SIG, and I can shoot it. I might stumble across a great deal, which I did recently, on 40, where I could buy, cases of 40 for, I forget, but it was way less than 20 cents a round. Good law enforcement 40 cal, which we'll get to other stuff besides guns later in the episode. But don't think that because it's M40 that it's a bad deal, because if you get it for such a good deal because it's M40 that you can buy a 9mm conversion barrel and still be cheaper, then you get a gun that has two different calibers that you're able to shoot. And a lot of pistols, not all, are capable of doing that. A lot of, at least the popular ones, you can get the 9mm conversion barrel for it. Getting back to the SIGs, the 229s, the 226s, and some of the really underrated SIGs. The SIG 220 is a fantastic gun. If you don't know, that's like the single stack big brother. It's the 45 ACP, also in 10mm. Fantastic guns. I don't know the model off the top of my head, but a gun that I would really, really like is kind of that mid-size carry gun that I don't have is the smaller single stack version of the SIG 229, whatever it is called. Made like a single stack. All the operating system is very similar to the SIG 226, 229, that whole series, but it's a single stacked kind of subcompact Commander 1911 sized handgun that came in 40, it came in 357 SIG, and it came in 9mm. Fantastic gun. Also, we talked about this one in the Ugly Ducklings podcast, but the SIG Pro, the SIG 2022, which ironically is this year's year, but it came out a long time ago. I don't know why they named it that model, but the 2022 is kind of this weird in-between where it's got the operating system, which is a great operating system of the SIG 229, 226s, but it's polymer frame, and they're made really well. They're super rugged. I think a very underrated kind of prepper gun. Talking about kind of in this generation, You may also even find some really cool like Ruger P89s. That whole Ruger P89, that aluminum, kind of super robust. It's one of those guns that's kind of ugly and beautiful at the same time. Very retro look to it. Very, I don't know how to say, early 90s fanny pack, parachute pants era kind of cool nostalgia to it. They're known for being rugged and robust. They would be a great prepper handgun just because they're aluminum and very simple to operate. But you might even find some of those as law enforcement trade-ins. Now, hitherto we've been talking about handguns, which is what most people think of when they think about police officers usually. Now, some of the cool stuff, submachine guns, you're obviously not going to be able to get because of just different laws here in the U.S. unless you have a ton of money. If you do, then you probably know what you want more than I'm going to be able to tell you or give you advice on. But police also use long guns, especially the more specialized units. Most police, for a big chunk of the 1900s to 20th century, use shotguns. Most of the time, I believe it was the Remington 870. And I love the old Remington Wingmasters and Police 870s. They are, in my opinion, so much far superior than the new ones. They are a piece of Americana, a piece of American craftsmanship that just, you remember when America used to make stuff like men out of steel and wood and craftsmanship instead of buying parts from China and CNC machines. Not that I don't love all the options we have today, but an old Remington Wingmaster Police or an actual Remington 870 Police is just a thing of beauty. Just thinking about those. I really wish that I had bought one when they were even cheaper, but you can still find them at a good deal. The Remington 870s. A really cool one, the Remington 870 Marine Magnum. You'll see those as law enforcement trade-ins sometimes for like Harbor Division Police and Harbor Police. But those are really cool too. But it's not just limited to the 870s. Even when I was LAPD, they still had some Ithaca 37s. And those are really cool guns. Those were kind of like the cool guy cop gun. Remember, probably just because there weren't as many, so people thought they were better. But they're a really cool gun, the Ithaca 37s. And I don't know everything off the top of my head, but I'm sure that several law enforcement agencies have used things like the Mossberg 500. I would be astounded if they didn't. The Mossberg 500s and the Winchester Model 12s, 1200s, and 1300s are spectacular. Again, they have that same American beauty and craftsmanship and just brings you back like the 1950s American work ethic when you hold one. They were never as popular as the 870, but I think every bit as good a shotgun. If you can find those police trade-in, again, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. Snag one of those suckers up if it fits a need that you have or if you want to collect one. And there's probably dozens. Again, there's all kinds of little small police departments that buy these things. There's probably shotguns. How about a Franke Spaz 12 police trade-in? You find one of those, that's kind of a hidden gem. That's kind of a tactical unicorn. But cool guns. A lot of police agencies use Benellis. My first tactical shotgun was a prior law enforcement Benelli M1 Super 90. And I sold that gun, and it's one of those guns that I'm not a gun collector, but I really wish I hadn't sold that gun. That was one of the best shooting shotguns I have ever put my hands on. It was light and handy and ridiculously reliable, and it pointed well. So all that to say, if you can find an older Benelli police trade-in, you don't really have to worry about police handguns getting shot out. You really don't have to worry about shotguns getting shot out. They get trained with usually and shot far less than handguns, which is not much to begin with. They're just usually really robust designs. So if you can find those. And let's not forget police also use rifles. More common today than it was. And some of those are going to be ineligible. Some of those are going to be military, given to law enforcement, like the old M16A1s, M16A2s, which obviously you're not going to be able to get. But a lot of times, law enforcement agencies will just buy a batch of ARs from FN or something like that. And you, a lot of times, can get those on the law enforcement surplus market. And they're great guns. But ARs are a dime a dozen. So let's talk about something a little bit cooler. Something I used in law enforcement that I sometimes prefer depending on the mission over an AR. And I had a full auto AR-15 variant, the CAR 15, I believe. Really, really cool gun. I liked it for a lot of missions, but a lot of times I preferred the Mini 14. Law enforcement for a long time, a lot of agencies use Mini 14s, and they're just cool guns. So, law enforcement trade in Mini 14s. Keep your eyes out for those. Those are cool guns. I'm not going to say that's a better rifle than an AR, but I'd say for a lot of situations, it's as good or better. In a lot of situations, the AR is better. I'd encourage you to not think of the Mini 14 as some backwater, redneck, I can't afford an AR-15 gun. If you look at the price of a good Mini 14, you can usually get a lot of ARs brand new from good manufacturers cheaper than a Mini 14. They have a lot going for them. They have a lot of advantages. I'm not going to get into that. We'll get outside the scope of this podcast. But Mini 14s are awesome, and a lot of agencies use them. I use them as a law enforcement officer, and I really liked them. They are really cool guns, and likely there are a bunch of other rifles that they use that I'm not aware of. You find an agency that had the SCAR 16s. Fantastic. Now let's talk about some other stuff besides the guns. Law enforcement trade in ammo. Did a whole episode on is the 40 Smith & Wesson relevant? And I'd say if you can get giant bulk 40 Smith & Wesson ammo for dirt cheap, then yeah, it is relevant. And you can often find really good law enforcement trade-in 40, because now is a time when a bunch of people are getting rid of the 40, dropping it because it's not hot anymore, going to the 9mm. Now, I will tell you that I think 9mm is a better caliber. But if you can get a screaming deal on a police trade-in 40 and a screaming deal on good quality 40 caliber ammo for practice and defense, the most important thing is you get a gun and you train with it. If you're just talking about the dirt cheapest 9mm and the dirt cheapest 40, yeah, the 9mm is going to be cheaper. But if you're talking about really good premium like Winchester Ranger or Spear Gold Dot, a lot of times you can find a ton of that ammo because police departments are switching away from it for a really, really good price. And if you can get a good deal on good premium practice and defensive ammo, why not? It's most common in 40, but you can perhaps find some good trade-in ammo in 45 ACP or 357 SIG. And if you have that caliber anyway, why not take advantage of those good deals? And what about a bunch of other stuff? We often think about military surplus gear like web gear and stuff like that, Alice packs. Well, law enforcement has gear too. And some really well-made gear, a really good duty police holster made of leather, if it's properly taken care of, will last generations. And sometimes you can get a really good deal on those. You're looking for a good hiking holster for, a Glock or something like that, or maybe an older revolver. You might be able to get an heirloom quality, really beautiful leather holster. It has a lot of character and still has a lot of life left in it for not a lot of money. Also, too, Sam Browns. What you think of as a cop duty belt, we call those Sam Browns. Those have a lot of other uses, and those things are robust, to say the least. You're probably not wearing one of those day to day. It's an EDC belt. But for carrying a big revolver hiking, they're a fine belt for that. How about other categories? Magazines. Law enforcement trade-in magazines. There's a ton of those floating around out there. Beretta 92s, SIG 226, 229s, even older gen Glock mags. If you're looking for some training mags. Now, Glock mags are so cheap, you might not save a whole lot unless you find a good deal at a gun show or something, or a good deal at a local gun shop. But on some of those more spendy mags, a SIG mag could cost you $50 or more. Find a law enforcement trade-in one for $25. Why not? The worst probably, you could have some major issues with a magazine, but probably the biggest thing is the spring's going to be worn out. Just put a new spring in it. Springs are cheap. So don't just think about the surplus world as military surplus. There's a lot of other people that carry guns for a living. Keep that in mind. Check that out. And again, I'm not a gun collector, but maybe you are. Maybe you aspire to be. Maybe instead of trying to get into something that's overcrowded and the prices and the good deals on those have kind of gone away. Again, there was a time when you could get Mosin Nagants, pretty much any kind you wanted, unless it was a finished one or something, for under $100. Those days are gone now. Maybe it doesn't make a lot of sense to collect those. Maybe you can collect old police revolvers. Maybe that's what you want to collect. Maybe you want to collect those first really adopted semi-auto police handguns in the U.S., the handguns that cops used when they switched from the revolver. Again, the Smith & Wesson 59s, the hkusps, things like that. That would be a pretty cool collection. And they're also capable of fighting handguns. The Beretta 92s, they're pretty common. There were a lot of them made. They were really popular for a really long time, and they're still popular. And they're kind of seeing a resurgence. But the Beretta 96s, which were common in law enforcement for a time and aren't really coveted right now, that wouldn't be a bad collector gun. And again, most of these are still fully capable, fully useful handguns that have a lot of life left in them. Again, sadly, a lot of cops are not gunfighters, and they don't shoot a ton. And those guns, although they might have been carried a lot, they probably haven't been shot as much as you think. And they probably have a lot of life left in them. So whatever reason you might be into these, there's several. You might want to become a collector of police gear. You want to become a connoisseur in that world. Or maybe you just want a really good deal on a really good, capable handgun that has a few nicks and has a good amount of character to it. Maybe that's your thing. And that's a good thing too. Maybe you have enough money that you want to arm a small contingent, a militia, a mag, a group of people, and you want them all to have a similar thing, and you can get a good deal on, some really good police trade-in 870s and Gen 3 Glocks. Why not? There's a number of reasons you might want to look into. Law enforcement surplus, law enforcement trade-in, whatever you want to call it. Well, I hope that you see the value in these things, and I hope that you see the value in this podcast. If you do, consider going to goodshepherdtraining.com. That's all I'll really say about that today. goodshepherdtraining.com. Tactical tip of the day is going to be on restoring old leather. Now, you may have heard of things like saddle soap, but there's some other things that work well, especially if you're talking about in the gun world. Ballistol. Ballistol you may know for cleaning guns and lubricating guns. Ballistol is great for wood and leather, especially leather. As long as you don't mind the smell, I actually like it. Got that nice black licorice smell, and I really like that smell. But if you don't mind that, Ballistol is great for wood and great for restoring old leather, dry old leather. If you don't have Ballistol, just regular old cooking oil can do wonders for just old dried out leather. So if you're buying some of this old leather surplus, as long as it's not so dried out that it's like cracked and split open, then you can usually restore it quite well with just that. And if you don't know, in law enforcement we had the black leather gear, or I suppose it would work on brown leather gear too, just shoe polish. That's what we use with shoe polish. You get an old piece of black web gear, black leather gear from law enforcement surplus, hit it up with some shoe polish. I say that kind of offhand because I grew up and joined the military back when we had black leather boots that we still had to polish and iron our uniform. I realized after saying that a lot of people may not know how to polish leather. Now, it does take quite a bit of skill to get something super shiny, but if you're just trying to restore the leather with shoe polish, just rub it on, let it sit, and wipe it off. Really, that's it. In fact, if you're talking about a tactical application, you probably don't want it shiny in the first place. That is your tactical tip of the day. Tactical verse of the day from Acts. What shall we do? Then Peter said to them, repent, and let every one of you be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins, and you shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. For the promise is to you and to your children and to all who are afar off, as many as the Lord our God will call. That's me. I was afar off. And I am thankful every day that the Lord God called me. By His grace I have repented, been baptized in the name of Jesus Christ. And I hope that you listening out there are also in that category, or the promised people in your seed. If that speaks to you, check out a whole other podcast, Simple Man Sermons. It is the flagship podcast. It is commercial free, and it is the gospel broken down for the simple man. With that, men, thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.